And hello, and welcome back to the Dutiful Future show. This is episode 6, and with me today, I have a very special guest, my good friend and flatmate, Matt Alexander. Hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm fantastic, Matt. How are you?
I'm great, wonderful.
Who are you, and what do you do?
I am Matt. I am a 21-year-old, second-year PPE student at work.
Fantastic. And what are you here today to talk about, Matt?
Liberalism, is it the end? It is the end.
Fantastic. Okay, well, that's some very nice foreshadowing there. No spoilers. So we have 3 sections today, all about liberalism as the ideology. The first one is basically the background. What is it? Is it dying? Are we in the process of it dying? Number 2 will be the real meat of the episode, which is why. What are the reasons? What are the core concepts or situations that have led to liberalism depleting in this sense? And the last section will be, well, what now? Are we glad it's gone? What are going to be the alternatives? And what do we expect out of this crazy, kooky time? So I think there's only one very obvious question that I'm sure my nan and my mum are wondering. Matt, what's liberalism?
That's probably the hardest question in all of politics, to define liberalism. It's obviously about freedom, about maximising freedom, and that is it. And the fact it's ambiguous is why the field of liberalism is so broad, so complex, so confusing, and how there can be so many arguments made which seem contradictory in the name of liberalism.
So how would you say liberalism has been applied in terms of government over the last, or at least over the period of where it has been most dominant? What would you say that the main policies or the most grounded concepts in which liberalism has been applied?
Well, I think that's the tricky question, is that liberalism, if you look in the UK at least, liberalism has probably had 3 stages. So you had, before the First World War, you had what people call classical liberalism, laissez-faire, which was the government's job is to stay out of your way, or what Isaiah Berlin would call negative freedom. And then between the wars, you had a failure of liberalism. You had liberalism in crisis, and you saw the rise in Europe of fascism and communism as alternatives. And then you saw a renewal of liberalism with embedded liberalism, some people call it.
Okay.
Which is liberalism with mostly socialist aspects on top of it, but you keep the key liberal points of the rule of law, private property, etc. And then you saw this system break down in the 1970s, which resulted in the rise of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the USA, and the rise of neoliberalism, which then spread also across Europe, mostly in the 1990s, with the introduction of the single market in Europe is one instance of this neoliberalism.
So would you say that this, as you brought up, the liberalism spread across Europe in a certain time period, would you say that this depletion is specifically a UK thing or just a US thing? Or is it something where it is the entire ideology across the world, everywhere it is present, it is currently on its way out?
Yeah, I think it's failing in... I can't think of a place right now where, it's everyone's in love with liberalism, to be honest. From the left and the right, it seems to be attacked globally.
Okay, very interesting. So would you say that specifically right now liberalism is officially done, dead, we've moved on, or are we in the process of its decline, or are we simply lowering it into its coffin? Where would you say we are?
I think it's in crisis. So if you were to compare the 2010s to the 1920s, the 1930s, or the 1970s, you would see political economy in crisis. You have unemployment across Europe. You had incomes did not grow for the first time, I think, since 1830s or the 1820s in the UK, that is. And you saw the rise of alternative movements, whether that's green movements, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, whatever, and you see a yearning for something different.
So what would you say are the key markers and signposts that liberalism is on its way out? What are the canaries in the coal mines, would you say, which indicate to everyone, right, this ideology it's depleting, it's finishing?
I think if you look at political movements, the energy within liberalism, so if you compare the 2010 UK general election candidates, you had Nick Clegg, a Liberal, David Cameron, a Liberal Conservative, and Gordon Brown, part of the New Labour Labour Party. And then you compare that to 2019, where you had the Liberal Democrats, the Liberal Joe Swinson lost her seat, so that's a failure. You have Jeremy Corbyn, who's certainly not a Liberal, and you had Boris Johnson, who is part of this new movement on the right, which is unidentifiable, complex, but an alternative. And you can see the same in America. So you had, in 2008, you had Obama versus McCain, which they're both very liberal centrist candidates. And then by 2016, you had Donald Trump versus Clinton, and Clinton, despite being against possibly the worst presidential candidate in terms of qualifications and in terms of, saying the right thing, and she got defeated.
So would you say that, you very well strongly ascribed to the different changes in terms of the parties, in terms of the ideology? Would you say that if there was going to be a sort of ejector seat for the liberal ideology, for one group or one person to be the one who can escape this sort of depletion and try and keep it alive, can you identify any world leaders or politicians around right now who could potentially be the ones to try and revive this movement?
Yeah, of course you've got Macron, who seems to buck the trend, though his policies are also complex in terms of he's not a simple liberal, because liberals don't generally get the police to beat up protesters. That's not generally
that's normally the list of things that they're not desperate to do, but
the rule of law, etc., the right to protest is usually a liberal.
Usually,
but he is he's from the centre. He talks like a liberal. He sounds like a liberal, and I think he's best placed. Obviously, the EU is something that is proud of its liberalism, and is most likely, if liberalism was to have a revival in its current state, I think the EU would be probably the best vehicle for that.
To apply this to my favourite topic in the world, American politics, you could say there are quite a number of, you would say, I guess, liberal candidates in the race, and some of whom are doing okay. They're still pretty strong. Klobuchar, Biden's on his way out, but then, for example, even Buttigieg is probably like the Obama light in more ways than one. Do you see that as potentially, if there's a chance that candidates like Buttigieg could push beyond Bernie's success right now and really change what we're saying right now? Because I imagine a liberal president would really shift this kind of conversation away from, all right, it's going now, it's all going to be gone, what's next, to, oh, okay, the most powerful country in the world is still on this track.
I think there's 2 or 3 things to be said about that. I think, firstly, if you look at ideas in America, the idea of liberal ideas doesn't excite people. There's not, Pete Buttigieg is it's almost like none of the above candidate is why don't we keep things the same? And if you look at Macron in France, he was against Marine Le Pen, and it's like, all right, maybe we don't want an ethno-nationalist, just vote for the other guy.
Makes sense.
That's one. 2 is, yes, like maybe in America there will be no better choice than liberalism. That is the case in all the crises of liberalism, is in both the 1970s and the 1920s and 30s, is if there was not a better alternative, liberalism stuck around. And that if people don't come up with a plausible alternative, then liberalism won't die, because you can't get rid of liberalism without replacing it.
So you could say that liberalism has always been an ideology doomed to fail, because the only thing keeping it alive was a lack of a strong alternative to it.
Well, that's one way of putting it, but I think that's the same with every ideology. Is the reason it's alive is because there's not a better one. That's how politics works. You pick the best alternative.
Fair enough then. Very interesting. Okay, that was a good little broad overview of liberalism, and in the next segment we are going to go over in very much detail what are the specific reasons and why. I have multiple theories placed, and we'll have Matt present what he thinks in a very exciting segment, as always. Loud and very long varsity ad there. Whoever calibrated this before me had it on full volume with not the best mic quality, but that's fine. That's not my problem. My only problem is liberalism and what's happening to it. So in the first segment, we went over sort of the basics. What is it, and where is it still present, and where is it sort of falling off? And now we are just going to go over what are the main reasons for liberalism's death and depletion across the world. Matt, what would you say would you ascribe as the main reasons you see liberalism as failing?
I think there's three liberalisms really to talk about. There's the economic liberalism, social liberalism, and cultural liberalism. And out of the 3, I think most failings come from economic, and most of the cultural issues actually stem from economic as well. And then I think there's 3 reasons why economic liberalism is failing. Firstly, you had the Great Financial Crash and the Great Recession in 2008 to 2009, and then you've had the lack of a growth since then. So again, average incomes have not risen in the UK, and you have the increase in the distribution of income is widening, inequality is widening, and then you have globalization, which is people feeling left behind, and the race to the bottom means that unless you, in the UK, it feels as if you just want to get a steady job, you're under immense pressure, you're on a 0-hours contract, and there's no comfort, there's no shelter from this competition, and that leads to the cultural issue where people feel vulnerable or exploited by international forces rather than belonging to a nation and a caring and compassionate nation state. It seems to be on the way out. And that's the left behind you see talked of in the Brexit vote, in Boris Johnson, in Donald Trump. And so the economic and the cultural is definitely linked. But also you obviously have the internet, etc., where the lines between the nation state and global issues is blurred. And then socially is probably, it's something that we all like to celebrate. The movement of social liberalism, I think, is something the Liberals should be most proud of from the 1960s, the end of hanging, decriminalisation of homosexuality, and then the gay marriage.
Yep.
All these things are great. But the issue with that is, of course, not with that, but the issue with social liberalism...
all these things are nice, but...
social liberalism, there's another element which is focused on the individual, away from the family and the community, and you do see a crisis for loneliness in the UK. I think it's about 40% of people consider themselves lonely when asked if they feel lonely in the last week. 40% of people. And you have a mental health crisis amongst young people, loneliness amongst old people. In the US, you've got an opioid crisis, which stems from loneliness. And you often see, you've got mass shootings and a decaying of society due to this individualism, I believe.
So would you say that, when you say to someone in its most broad sense, when you make that link between the liberal ideology and loneliness, do you want to flesh out that connection a little bit more? Because if I said to someone who wasn't as in tune with these sort of issues, it's because of liberalism that people are lonely. They would certainly say, "Oh, that seems ridiculous." That's quite almost a tenuous link. How would you say you would roadmap that a bit more, I guess, clearly?
So liberalism is focused on the individual, so on individual rights, individual freedom. And then that comes at a cost of community solidarity, etc. So you see the decline of trade unions, for instance. You see also, if you're going to look at the right, you see the decline of churchgoers. And then you also see the idea that each individual is an entrepreneur or brand, that you should be changing jobs. So there's lack of job stability. You've also seen the decline of state support for families. You see... So it's the decline of society because liberalism rewards the individual without recognising, of course, an individual needs a community, a society. So austerity is a great example of a liberal policy saying the state should not be involved in this, and then you realise without the state, when you run out of community clubs and school support, lots of young people get lonely, and it's the same with old people. When their church closes down, their community centre closes down due to austerity, then people will become lonely.
That actually... already countered the actual point I was going to make. I was going to say, well, would you not say that, one could say that liberalism as an ideology isn't discouraging these sort of communitarian factors, but it's saying what matters is you and yourself. You have the choices to make these sort of things and form communities, but in all, it is just in yourself. But an amazing counterexample, obviously, it would be austerity in terms of, community centres, for example, being shut down, where it's, hey, it doesn't matter, you're your own person and do what you want. And you could certainly sort of ascribe this sort of overly individualistic model of liberalism to people feeling left behind, causing a lot of reactions. So it almost sounds like, from your perspective, it's a very simple reason why liberalism is depleting as an ideology, and it's simply that it's failed. It has, led to a lot of undesirable outcomes in a lot of specific areas. And I guess the natural question would be, do you think this was inevitable? Do you think this was an inherent core of liberalism that if you take it to at this step, and we're at this point where liberalism has been around for a while, this was always going to happen? Or is this simply bad applications of the concept in certain areas?
I think you need to look at what liberalism is, and so liberalism usually fused. It's usually a part of your character. So you had, like embedded liberalism, or what Roger Scruton would say was liberalism is a great vehicle to ride somewhere. But what you have now is you've sort of got a naked liberalism, where it's great if you stand back from individuals to choose, because you have socialist programs and conservative programs. You've got your church, community centres, and you've also got state support, etc. And then people can get into communities. But
Okay.
when you pull back and you have economic liberalism, social liberalism, cultural liberalism, you leave people isolated. And it's the same if you look at economic liberalism, because it's so exploiting, so like harsh. You end up with no shelter and people get hurt.
So you could say that perhaps like from the success of liberalism being applied in its early years, the people who sort of ascribed to the ideology got caught up in the concept and, for example, as you said, forgot that it wasn't the destination. It was merely the journey to try and get there. It was a tool to achieve certain ends, but it became the be all and end all.
Yeah. And I think what's a really interesting point about this is neoliberalism, which is the latest form of liberalism, really. Actually, neoliberal policies turn people into how neoliberals view people. So I think we all know about the economic man, that idea of a self-maximising individual. So there was a study in Israel University, and at the beginning of their 3-year course, I think it's a 4-year course actually, they were more compassionate, more social in attitude, and by then they were more selfish.
Wow.
So what you have is neoliberalism is based on a false representation of an individual, but what happens is through neoliberalism you shape the people into the neoliberal representation of humanity, and therefore what you've had is this cultural process which has come along about independence, about solidarity, etc. But of course now you have the result, which is individuals cannot function as an individual.
Yeah, there was a great article I read which was very similar to that, which it was specifically focusing on Blair, but also neoliberalism as a whole, and it sort of argued that the sort of economic policies which it applied were almost dehumanizing in a sense, because it placed a person's value specifically on what value they would have in a market. It would say that, you know, your only value is what you can offer to an economy, and there is nothing else to a person. So, for example, when mines close, you are now valueless as a person, and you have to teach yourself or, you know, educate yourself in order to, for example, you know, the classic neoliberal trope, learn to code in order to give yourself value. And I think a lot of the time, people often, they see these issues, you know, when you study economics particularly, you see these issues and you go, okay, here's the economic outcomes, but we forget the actual personal and psychological side of it, which is it's extremely dehumanizing to be, you know, relegated to something so small, to say you are merely a number in an economic system.
And of course, mining communities were proud of being a mining community.
Exactly.
And people's personality is shaped by their jobs, etc. But what's really interesting that I wanted to pick up on is the idea that the argument of dehumanization. So if you look at the 2016 Brexit referendum, and you look at the two sides, and obviously one side was successful, one side was not in their arguments. And the main argument for remaining was you'll be better off economically. But the issue with that is, of course, there's more to life than being better off economically. And you also see, so the EU was just associated with, you know, we don't like it, but it makes us richer. And it was the same argument actually made by Remainers for immigration. They didn't say, we should have immigration for the cosmopolitanism. They said, immigrations come here and benefit our economy. So even when supporting immigration, they were doing it in this neoliberal, dehumanising way. Whereas if you look at the Leave argument, it was about a romantic appeal to the community, to the nation, which of course entices a lot more people. And interestingly, it enticed the people who were alive before the neoliberal wave, whereas the newer citizens, newer voters, just for the economic argument. It's quite an interesting.
So perhaps one could categorise something like the Brexit referendum not as, categorise it as simply a rejection of this overly financial concept of what our government should be. We should only do things which make us economically, you know, better off, and the sort of the focus of, you know, almost like when you see now a lot of people are trying to reject GDP as like our key economic factor, because it's saying, well, wealth isn't everything. There's things like underemployment, there's things like hours worked, you know, there's working conditions, there's a million other things that would go into.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to say two things on that. Firstly, exactly that, because if you look at how the UK's always viewed the EU compared to other European nations, the UK's always viewed it as, you know, often the EU or the ECC was always synonymous with what politicians called the single market. So it was always an economic neoliberal policy in the first place. Whereas if you look in Germany or France, they view it as a European project.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, quite often in their immigration figures, they don't count intra-EU migration as migration.
Mm-hmm.
So if a Greek moves to Germany, quite often they're not actually on the immigration figures. Whereas, of course, in the UK, EU migration was huge. And secondly, about the GDP and social well-being, there was a paper out recently which showed that one of the things that correlated with the Trump vote most wasn't anything to do with economics. It was actually, if you look at social well-being status, that was actually the key correlation.
Mm.
So maybe we need to look further into, as the economy sort of dislocates from the obvious, everyone has the same job, etc., and to look to more fundamental views on whether people are content with their lives, their jobs, etc.
Yeah, I read a great article, which was not a great article, a terrible article, but one which applies to this quite specifically. It was about basically trying to ascribe the Trump presidency and his victory entirely to race, and it brought up that point of saying, these Trump areas, they're not like a lot of the people who voted for him weren't terribly they're not a lot of them weren't in abject poverty. They weren't particularly well off. They were like just below middle class. And therefore, that would show that it's a racial thing. Mm-hmm. But as you said, it's not just about how much money you take in each month. It's a social, it's a communitarian. There's a lot more around the issue. So would you say that the reason that you ascribe to liberalism as a whole dying and these sorts of rejections of the concept being centered around two things: economic factors, but specifically in terms of not just beyond GDP and those sort of things, but also a more personal concept in terms of how people feel they are treated and are considered.
Yeah, well, fundamentally it's because liberalism at its heart views humanity incorrectly. It views us as an amalgamation of individuals all sort of standing alone and just happen to be together.
Self-serving, calculating, rational.
Or just that you can separate the individual from the society is a really radical thing that is at the heart of liberalism, the idea of individual rights. And it's just not a true reflection of humanity. Humanity is a natural social animal.
Okay, very interesting. So now I have a couple arguments presented by very different thinkers. I'm sure you've heard of Francis Fukuyama.
Of course.
Anyone who studied any politics at University of Warwick will have heard of him several times. Fukuyama, in 1992, famously declared that it was the end of history, specifically due to the death of communism, meaning that liberalism and liberal democracy was the only prevailing ideology left. However, very recently he postponed his assertion, and he said that he was in fact wrong, or at least he was, I think as he described it, he was too early in his proclamation, specifically because of various different movements. And what Fukuyama attributed to this he specifically said it was, rather than for the points brought up by you, was identity, the demand for dignity, and the politics of resentment. So the politics of resentment was, I would say, would fall in, but demand for recognition was a big one they brought up, and he essentially ascribed it as identity politics. And, and it was, I guess, a rejection of this sort of individualism in a sense. And his quite interesting quote was, "Everything from Me Too to Trump, Black Lives Matter to Brexit is down to identitarianism." Would you say that identity in this sort of sense is a key drive, or is it a much more personal thing?
No, I think actually that encompasses a lot of what I've said. I think the issue with when people start talking about identity politics, etc., it's almost like liberals view it as some sort of backward step, but that's just not true. It's an essential part of humanity is to belong in your society, and I think what happens is, the worrying thing about liberalism is if they rob people of their identity, then it becomes, you get afterwards more radical, more scary identity. So you see that in the Weimar Republic, where Germans felt alienated both by the Treaty of Versailles and also because of the Weimar Republic did not seem to represent them. And then you come up with an ultra-aggressive form of identitarian politics. And you can see the same now. The more you stifle natural identity, so natural sense of belonging, etc., the more people can whip up hatred and more divisive forms of identity.
Interesting. And so we spoke earlier when you sort of gave us a brief overview of liberalism as over different time periods. And I guess we sort of ascribed this sort of death of liberalism as quite a recent phenomenon. But quite a famous book by a man by the name of Lowy. He wrote in his book The End of Liberalism in 1969, where he described basically pressure groups and interest groups, specifically as the death of liberalism. And I guess that sort of falls into the identity issue, but he essentially said, especially in America, he described as pressure groups and interest groups increased in power and money, that America had formed a second republic, one that was dominated by which groups had the most money and which groups would be the most powerful. Could you say that liberalism has actually been on its way out further than we would generally ascribe, specifically due to pressure groups, or is it much more of a grassroots rejection of status quo?
Well, I think the first point is one of the issues with economic liberalism is I think is it the Matthew law in the Bible, which says the more someone owns, the more they receive.
Okay.
And that's the same with money. The more capital you have, the more capital you gain, because that's how economies of scale work. So therefore, it's this disabling nature of liberalism, which is when you let people accumulate capital, it's destabilizing because then you get powerful people. And that is one weakness of liberalism, and why economic liberalism without redistribution does cause oligopolies. But secondly, I don't think it's a case of, the reason liberalism is failing is because there's very rich pressure groups who are misleading the people. I think there is a genuine dislike of liberal ideology across the world right now.
So you would say that, for example, to apply this to Brexit, whilst there are inherent issues in liberalism to do with pressure groups and interest groups and their influence, things like Brexit weren't really affected by that. This was more of a grassroots issue, which was a large group of people simply rejecting a form of establishment status quo.
Yeah, I think the UK Brexit, of course, that's a whole nother radio show. Yeah. But I think the issue with Brexit is, firstly, the UK, lots of UK citizens do not identify as European. It's a lot lower than every other European country. They're always outsiders. And that in the UK, the EU is always represented as a neoliberal market, and people didn't feel a sense of belonging for that, didn't feel a sense of community, and Take Back Control utilised that greatly. And it was like, take back control, come back to a nation state, come back to a community, come back to compassionate politics, where we'll treat you as humans, we'll give you identity, and lots of people yearn for that.
So to take this back to the question of, was liberalism always doomed to fail, aside from the point of whether external factors would change this, to consider it purely routinely, Lowe, he argued that liberalism was always going to doom to fail, because this was quite early on and quite a radical book at the time, and he essentially said from this point on there is no going back because of this amount of money in politics, which would lead to some forms of great rejection. So would you say that this sort of failing is internally inevitable for liberalism as an ideology, barring any sort of change from, for example, competing ones?
No, I don't think that money in politics is necessarily the reason for a liberal failure, or that because of this it's inevitable. I think you can have money in politics and have a decent debate still, and have, in the end, lots of money in politics. Rich people can be nice, basically. Rich people can have good interests as well.
So would you not say that, for example, the issues of money in politics drove this sort of anti-establishment rhetoric, which I think a lot of people would ascribe to certain issues like Trump and or Brexit? But would you say that these sort of anti-establishment points either aren't influenced as much by money politics, or are they or is that simply less of a factor, and it's more about the greater concepts and the sort of treatment in general?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's the greater concepts, because if you look comparatively, so the USA does have a huge issue with money in politics, but for instance, the UK has really good laws in money in politics. So the Conservative Party and the Labour Party have almost always had equal funding. Labour have got it from trade unions, and then businesses and entrepreneurs have backed the Conservative Party, and you still have exactly the same reactions against liberalism, and you've got it across Europe as well, where they have very good controls on money in politics.
Okay, very interesting. I have another argument presented by a man called Patrick Deenan. He sees liberalism as the ideology of the elite. He described it as it was always going to be doomed because it was merely a concept to maintain the status quo, whether from the left or right. Liberalism was always inherently alienating others, and he described a great disillusionment with the average voter. Oddly, from a when you hear that sort of sentence, it sounds very Marxist, but from a very conservative perspective, Patrick Deenan. So would you ascribe these sort of disillusionment as alienating, perhaps liberalism as merely a ideology of status quo, or do you think it deserves more recognition than that?
No, I think that's an argument I'm very sympathetic to, because what liberalism does is it rejects what the cultures of the people are, the cultures, the sentiments of the people, in favour of a sort of liberalism. The best thing about liberalism for policymakers is it's like it's a bit like, it's an IKEA box. You can send it to Iraq after you've burnt down Iraq, and you just go pop it up, and we'll have a great liberal state
politics
here. Exactly. Whereas, if you have more genuine politics where you look at the true nature of people, it means each institution's got to be bespoke to the nation, and that's where liberalism fails, is because it sticks onto and ignores the cultures of people and just sticks on the true universal liberal values.
So you could say the universal liberal values, or the concept of the perfect democracy that needs to be spread around the world, it simply just doesn't fit in certain areas, or it is too simplistic of a model to apply to certain
absolutely.
countries. Okay, so could you almost say that there's almost an inherent contradiction in liberalism in terms of how you describe it, because you say that it ignores people's wants and needs and sort of ignores how people are, contrasting with its extreme focus on the individual. Would you say there's some form of conflict internally in the ideology to say that we care about the individual, but we're going to ignore the specific different cultural aspects of each one? Yeah,
well, the issue is that individuals don't have culture. Communities and societies have culture, and that's where if you break society down into individuals, all the bonds between people are purely ignored, and therefore your liberal ideology just will not recognise it.
There was another article I read that was described as the New Republic, and it essentially its title was "Liberalism is dying, but it can be saved," and it had quite a weird point, because I think, in fairness to it, its definition of liberalism was very broad, and it literally just said liberalism is a belief in liberal values. So, and I think it was an American article, so it probably just meant by that the most basic things like gay marriage and pretty much everything that you would describe to basically being left-wing liberal. Well, you're not even left-wing, just being part of a Western society, I guess. And it essentially argued that whilst a lot of people would describe certain movements, certain grassroots movements, such as Green Party politics, as a rejection of liberalism in a sense, it described these movements as the savior of liberalism, almost in a communitarian model. It basically said that people can form communities around these issues that they want to push. So rather than maybe a national formed community or a local formed community, it had community in terms of beliefs and issues. Could you say that a point for liberalism would be that it's not about communities in terms of who lives around you or what you do. It's communities of what you believe in and what your values are?
No, I disagree with that fundamentally. I don't think you can form a society around we all want to save the planet. I don't think that's a bond deep enough. That's an intellectual bond rather than this sort of affectionate, compassionate bond that is what makes a community. But
could you not say that when I asked you earlier about the differences between whether it's people whether certain issues is because of their anti-establishment beliefs or whether it is thinking around broader concepts, that a sort of anti-liberalism stance requires that sort of intellectual agreement, and does not fall into the same category as an alignment of community around values.
So can you repeat
Sorry, does that make any sense? I got lost in my own words. What I tried to say was, when I asked you earlier about whether issues like Brexit or Trump are specifically anti-establishment or whether they're more of a rejection of status quo as an ideology in certain ways, you leant towards the idea of saying, well, it's more about the concepts that people reject, and that's what's aligning people. But could you say that this sort of rejection of these concepts requires the same intellectual, community in a sense, or alignment that would require this sort of liberal theory of we are united in our beliefs?
Yeah, I think the issue is that I don't see Brexitism as a culture, nor do I see Trumpism as a culture. It's a movement. Well, I mean, I don't really want to speak about Trump.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I don't know what Trump whoever's movement, but there's for instance, there's Corbynism, there's socialism. It's a movement, but it's not a community. There's a British community, there's a London community, but socialism is not a community; it's a movement, an intellectual movement where people share ideas rather than share culture and share beliefs.
So they're two very different concepts, which
I believe
and
so.
one can be aligned on, but one could not.
Yeah.
This article also describes sort of anti-liberalism in all its forms as purely a phase, almost akin to some sort of goth teenager, as it put it. Would you say that could potentially have some weight, that this is merely a reaction to things, like you said, like economic factors which are being worsened or increasing inequality, and if those problems were solved, then the concept would be saved? Or would you say that, no, this is not a phase, this is very much a rejection of the entire concept, and it is going to be abandoned?
Well, this actually, interestingly, ties into the first question you asked me, what is liberalism? And I said, the fact it's so ambiguous is the difficulty of it. But it's also its greatest asset. So, because if you look at the two crises beforehand that I spoke of in the 20s and the 30s, and then in the 70s, liberalism was in crisis, and it remade itself. So you had, Keynes, I think, is probably the saviour of liberalism in the 1930s, because he managed to form a liberal state, with Beveridge as well, and the new liberal wave, which is a liberal state which incorporates the needs of the people at the time to have full employment, to have belonging, to create a more shared and equal society. And then in the 1980s, you had liberalism revamped because you suddenly had things are moving again. You had low inflation and it was saved again. That's more economically focused, but you also have, the social liberalism in the 1960s gave it great energy too. And of course now, if you have a new intellectual wave which incorporates ideas. So we were talking about candidates earlier. Andrew Yang, I think, is someone who's a new wave liberalism, you could say, a new wave liberal. That's great if you have a new wave of liberalism which respects the nation state and the sense of belonging and all the other issues I mentioned, and they sort of bundle in a liberalism which incorporates new features which solves the liberal issues. That's great, and that could happen. And the issue now is, I think there's two issues. Is firstly, the failure of liberals to recognise this, because the main liberals are focused on big cities where they don't see the issues of the left behind people. They're almost segregated. So you've got, for instance, in the Democrat Party, they think, I'll just get Michael Bloomberg in. Or, in the UK, the journalists were like, we're going to have a Lib Dem surge, completely out of touch with the people. So there's no recognition for liberal renewal, which is very terrifying if you're a liberal, because there's definitely a need to renew liberalism. And secondly, it's very difficult to create and reform an ideology, because if you look at Keynes, new liberalism started at the turn of the 20th century with, you had philanthropy, and then you also had 1906 big liberal victory, and you had like progressives and populists in America. There was this big wave. It took about 40 years. And again, if you look at neoliberalism, Hayek, etc., that took about 40 years. And then there's been this stasis and a big hole in politics because no one challenged neoliberalism throughout the 90s until the financial crash. And now, even now, it's like people are scrapping around with new ideas without a coherent, and there's no desire to build a new thing. So, like, Andrew Yang was great, but is it coherent? Is it persuadable?
Okay.
There needs to be a building of a new liberal policy.
So in summary, the death of liberalism is brought about by it fundamentally misunderstanding just simply what humans are, and just treating humans as merely numbers and rejecting humanity and community is what you would say.
Yeah, it's the liberal vision is that you can distill a human being from society, and I think that first giant leap that Hobbes took, is impossible. You can't do that.
Fantastic. Well, that was a very interesting segment, and we're now going to our next song and ad. How much fun. This song is by Sean Paul, and it's called Calling on Me. Enjoy. Okay, back to the important stuff. I think after our first two segments, we can definitely very much say liberalism is dead. We spent a good 50 minutes to confirm that, which is obviously all you need. So section 3, liberalism is dead. What now? And are we happy about it? So first question is, Matt, are you happy about it?
In some ways, yes. I think there's ways you can improve society. Of course, you have to keep the basic tenets of liberalism, that is the rule of law, private property, equality under the law, etc. But I think what's scary is the failure to give an alternative, because there are alternatives that are daunting. The otherism that you see from Trump, for instance, and you have China, which has an alternative governance system, which I think is not good for humanity, and that's scary, of course.
So what would you say are the prevailing alternatives of liberalism across the world right now? You mentioned China. Would you say that in the UK and in, I guess, America and across Europe, or just the world, I guess, what would you say are the prevailing ideologies or systems which you think will, now and in the future, be the ones who could potentially replace liberalism as overarching concepts?
I think there's 3, possibly 4, different alternatives that are seen and put forward now. So firstly, you have nationalism, which I think China could even be included in that, in the idea of the nation comes first. And you see it in Viktor Orban and Putin too. And it gives people the identity, they feel lost. It gives them the shells from globalisation economically. Gives people that community feeling. But it's not a good idea. It's degrading. It makes the international community more fraught with danger. And then secondly, you have socialism, which is too often just reheated 1970s politics, which is not, again, that socialism, because too many socialist parties turned to neoliberalism in the 1990s or diet neoliberalism, then you haven't had the progression of genuine socialism, which means now it's taken a while for them to think, actually, how do we make socialism for the modern age? So that's that issue, is voters are seeing it and saying, well, we rejected this in the 70s and the 80s, so why would we want it now?
So you could say socialist groups, or socialism as an ideology, sort of hit the pause button in the 1970s and has gone, oh, wait a minute, we should go back to this and just hit play again. So there needs to be that development in order for it to become...
And you see it at varying stages. That's why you see, for instance, Bernie Sanders, in fairness to him, has a lot more of a 21st century ideal of socialism than... Because he's one of those that stuck to his, and he formed a platform,
his entire life.
He went to Burlington, was mayor there throughout the 80s, and then worked in the House of Representatives and the Senate as an independent. And then you have but Jeremy Corbyn, sadly, is not as intelligent a man, and he basically, his old politics comes from what would Tony Benn do, and Tony Benn was big in the 70s and 80s. So that's his. So you see this sort of separation, and socialism is, while exciting a movement, needs to catch up. Thirdly, you have this sort of more conservative approach, which I think is the Brexit approach, is a Boris Johnson approach, which is, we'll keep the liberalism, we'll sort out your inequality for you, regional inequality, we'll give you a shelter from globalisation, we'll give you this cultural conservatism, we'll be proud to be British. And it's sort of a moderation between the nationalism, you get the cultural identity of the nationalism, you get the redistribution of the socialism, and you get the cultural feeling of being conservative, the organic state, etc. But the issue with that is it's very hard to export because, as I said, conservatism is organic and it's hard to... You can't... It's not like IKEA, it's bespoke.
It's not something you can just implement. It is a developmental process.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously you have different types. So in Britain, where you have a very progressive liberal nation, the conservatism is also very progressive and liberal. You don't see Boris Johnson being anti-gay marriage, etc. Whereas you have Viktor Orban, who's conservative in Hungary, who is very oppressive. So it's like, if the shoe fits, then great, but occasionally that's not what you want. And then the fourth one, which I'm not sure about, is green politics.
Okay.
Sort of a green cosmopolitan internationalism, because green parties have been surging in Europe. And it's interesting because green party politics is almost as ambiguous as liberalism, because you have green liberals. You have green anarchists, you have green, and it's like, how do you tie this together?
There are even, at least in American certain states, there's a prominent green conservative movement which is entirely focused on cleanliness and community in terms of saying and
localism.
Yeah, exactly. So it could also be seen as broad. And to add on to the conservative point, there's a great quote by, I can't remember who, but it basically said, all progressives should want to be conservatives eventually. This should be the goal to where we can say, all right, I think we're pretty good. This is where we are. That should be the overarching goal. And so one defense I heard of, or at least not necessarily specifically of liberalism, but of its position in the world right now, is that would it not be, is it not a good thing for the world as a whole overall to have one overarching ideology? That's sort of also part of the liberal ideology, sort of by working with other nations and agreeing on these sort of values, it leads to greater peace. Since liberalism has been a dominant ideology, there hasn't been too much conflict in the world. So would you say that the sort of depletion of liberalism across the world is a negative thing in terms of it brings more uncertainty to global politics and to peace as a whole?
I think actually that thesis stems from a sad debasement of liberalism that you've seen in the last 20 years, away from diversity and tolerance, and towards homogeneity and equality, where people now assume that if you have different values or different disagreements, you can't agree. You can't have different cultures living side by side. You need to have the same cosmopolitan culture.
Okay.
And I think actually, no, you can have different cultures, and that's what makes the world such a rich place. Why bother going travelling if we've all got the same, if we've just got one culture everywhere?
Yeah, very interesting. That's a great note to end it on. Thanks so much for listening. Matt, do you want me to plug your Twitter?
No, thank you.
Never
I've got
mind.
enough followers.
I have it written down, but never mind then. So follow my Twitter instead. And then you can search through who I follow and you'll find Matt. Hugh Smiley1 on Twitter, dutifulfuture.com. The show's now on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and YouTube. This has been great. Thank you so much for coming on, Matt. Really enjoyed this. We're now going to go to our last song by the artist called The Magic Gang. And it's called Think.
Thank you.
Enjoy. Thank you very much.